Welcome to Pleasure in the Pause, a podcast dedicated to inspiring midlife women to feel more connected to their bodies, pleasure, and power through perimenopause, menopause, and beyond. I am your host, Gabriella Espinosa, and I'm so happy that you are here. Do you ever find yourself running through your to-do list during intimacy? Do you want to have sex with your partner, but just can't get in the mood? Or are you just not enjoying the sex that you're having, so you avoid it altogether? Well, you are not alone. My guest today is an expert in female sexual desire and has pioneered cutting edge research in the practice of mindfulness as a powerful tool to unite body and mind and have you saying yes to your pleasure. Dr. Lori Brotto is a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of British Columbia, a registered psychologist, and the Canada Research Chair in Women's Sexual Health. He is also the executive director of the Women's Health Research Institute, where she has fostered collaboration with hundreds of scientists to conduct in-depth research to advance women's health. You may have seen her on your television screen being featured on Netflix's The Principles of Pleasure. She is also the author of Better Sex Through Mindfulness, How Women Can Cultivate Desire, and the Better Sex Through Mindfulness workbook, which offer a groundbreaking method for improving desire, arousal, and sexual satisfaction through mindfulness. Welcome, Dr. Brotto.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. I'm really quite happy to be here.
I'm so excited. I did see you a few years ago on the Netflix docuseries Principles of Pleasure, which was such a fun and informative look at female pleasure, both from a women's story perspective and from a scientific perspective, which you offered. I love the way that you as a scientist address the topic in such a passionate, matter of fact, and accessible way. And I remember thinking to myself, who is this woman? I want to meet her. And here you are.
Oh, that's so kind. Yeah, the Netflix series was amazing because, of course, the platform is exactly the audience that we want to bring evidence-based information about sexual health to. So it was such a delight for me to be part of that series.
Absolutely. It was wonderful. And I highly recommend everyone going and taking a look at it because it's still on Netflix.
Mhm.
So now tell us, please, how did you land in this fascinating field of sexual health and pleasure? And were you always this comfortable talking about sex?
No, not at all. I mean, I fell into it by accident. I wish I had a story where I could say I had planned this from when I was a teenager, but really it was by accident. And if anything, I grew up without any sex education, never had the menstruation talk with my parents. In fact, grew up with stereotypes and beliefs that were really quite sex negative. So when I found myself landing a volunteer job as a young undergraduate student who was interested in research, and that volunteer job entailed looking at animal models of sexual dysfunction. So I would give the little rats different medications. I would put them in stressful environments and then measure the impact on their sexual activities. And did that for quite a number of years, I think 6 years in total. And it introduced to me this really the science of sexual activity, and that this was something that we could study in a research context. And it was fascinating to me. And then I made the switch over to human research the year that Viagra was approved. And you might be saying, well, how is Viagra, a treatment for erectile dysfunction, relevant to studying women's pleasure? And for me, it was a direct line because on the one hand, we have this effective, safe, discreet, relatively affordable treatment for sexual dysfunction in men, and we did not have anything comparable in women. And in that same year, there was a very large study that looked out at just how common sexual difficulties were, and it found that about a third of women experience distressing sexual problems. So, kind of putting those different pieces together, I decided to leave the rat lab and started to embark on research into women's sexuality.
Yeah, and I can sense that fire in your belly, that passion, because it's so um it's it's unfair, quite
Mhm.
frankly, that we are where we are today, and that women's health, women's sexual health is so underfunded, under researched. And I know that you are pioneering at your institute so many studies that are really going to change the landscape for so many of us. And you are already. So let's dive a little bit into your research. First of all, as a longtime yoga practitioner, mindfulness practitioner, I want to say thank you for the book, Better Sex Through Mindfulness: How Women Can Cultivate Desire. And it has an accompanying workbook, which I love, with all the practices.
Mm.
And I had dog-eared it in so many places where I've said, yes, yes, yes. And I think so many women will read this and see themselves in a lot of the stories that you share
Mhm.
and feel, wow, I'm not alone.
Yeah.
And you give such a great overview of the scientific evidence that forms the foundations of your work. And I was surprised to read that many sexual challenges that women face is prevalent, not prevalent across the age spectrum. So,
Yeah.
this podcast is focused on midlife women, but that, yeah, women in their 20s, 30s, 50s, 60s, and also women across cultures share similar experiences.
Yeah.
Can you share with us what some of those challenges are?
Yeah. So, certainly sexual complaints can affect women across the lifespan. And, we tend to think of, well, what is the impact of menopause? And certainly we know with the hormonal fluctuations that happen during the perimenopause. And then, of course, with the decline of estrogen levels that happen post menopause, that can give way to vaginal dryness, sleep disturbance, cognitive decline, memory issues, mood changes, all of which can directly impact sexual function. But we also know that there are quite a number of, if you will, non-hormonal contributors to sexual problems in women. So mood is one of them, depression, which is highly, highly prevalent. Probably 40% of the population either have clinical depression or subclinical depression. And when you think of what depression is, depression is really characterized by apathy, a lack of interest in things that you used to find interesting. And so lack of interest in sex is one of those. And so depression and low desire in particular often go hand in hand, and that can affect women across the lifespan. Another factor that we know much more about today than we did, say, 10 or 15 years ago is the role of chronic stress. And so we know that stress levels in society are at near epidemic levels. People will often say, I feel chronically stressed. And it's not necessarily the case that there's been a big traumatic event that's happened. It's more the day-to-day grind, the never-ending to-do list, feeling like you're on that hamster wheel of never being able to accomplish the things that you feel you should accomplish. And so that chronic stress can impact the brain, the body, our physiology, and certainly our sexual desire. Body image is another one that can
Mhm.
impact women across the lifespan. So negative feelings towards one's body that lead a person to maybe avoid not just sexual activity, but intimacy in general. I often hear women say, "I don't undress in front of my partner anymore because of the possibility that that might lead to sexual activity." And so you start to see these more global impacts on, again, not just sexual activity, but intimacy and the kinds of things that people really want to be engaging in. So those are definitely some of the big ones. And again, all of these factors can impact women across the lifespan.
That's so interesting. I definitely have felt many of those symptoms, especially as I was moving through the perimenopause to menopause transition, not even aware that that was really what was turning me away from intimacy. And we live in a modern, fast-paced world where we can often seek a quick fix to our health challenges. Whether it's a pill, a pat, a pellet, or a vibrator. Not to knock any of those things down, but you offer a refreshing alternative. Actually, one that's been around for thousands of years, and that's mindfulness. What was your aha moment that led you to look at mindfulness as a tool to support women with these issues? And could you first start by telling us what mindfulness is?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right, Gabriella, that meditation has been around for 3 to 4,000 years. And I always joke that, the Buddhist monks who were sitting in lotus pose meditating never turned or questioned one another. What's the evidence for this? They knew that it worked.
Yeah.
They knew from how they lived their lives, from the compassion that meditation embodied for them, that it worked for them. But, fast forward, we live in a modern day era where, we need evidence. We use evidence to make decisions about what kinds of treatments are offered or paid for in different healthcare settings, et cetera. So the moment for me was when I was a resident at the University of Washington, and I learned about mindfulness as part of a treatment for people who engaged in self-harm behavior as a way of managing rapid ups and downs in their mood. So these were individuals who, at one moment felt on top of the world and the next moment felt empty and dejected and disconnected from everyone around them. And they often turned to maladaptive behaviors as a way of coping. So whether it was through self-harm or drinking or using substances or et cetera. And so one of the leading treatments, dialectical behavior therapy, includes a component of mindfulness within that. And what I learned over the 2 years of being trained in dialectical behavior therapy is that tuning into difficulties, tuning into unpleasant sensations was far more effective than distraction or tuning out. And it was pretty compelling, and there was a lot of research to support the benefits of dialectical behavior therapy for these patients. And then at the same time, almost in a parallel universe, I was doing research with young cancer survivors. And the young cancer survivors I was working with shared with me stories about, a profound disconnect from their bodies, feeling betrayed, mourning the loss of their sexual arousal, not being able to sense any sensations related to sexual arousal in their body anymore. And I quite literally just had this light bulb moment, I think, because I was, learning dialectical behavior therapy one day and then quite literally the next day working with these cancer survivors in research. And I just had a moment of, could this tool be useful in some way for these cancer survivors to help them reconnect with whatever degree of sensation was still there? And so a combination of, me asking a group of cancer survivors, would they be willing to try this out? And then at the same time, I deeply immersed myself into personal mindfulness practice, going to groups, reading everything I could, getting a mindfulness teacher. And that then paved the way for a small pilot study where, as I was learning these mindfulness skills, I was delivering them to the cancer survivors and getting their feedback. And so, how are we using mindfulness in this way? Maybe a secular definition would be present moment, non-judgmental awareness in which every thought, sensation that arises is open to us to observe. And so it really is about observing sensations that arise just as they are, with kindness and compassion, without any attempt to change them and without any judgment of ourselves for how we go about observing those sensations. So that was really the kind of the foundation of where this started. And of course it evolved from there. And that was over 20 years ago.
Mm. Yeah, present moment non-judgment awareness. That's how you do it,
Mhm.
right? Yes. So such
Yeah.
an important skill, not only in the bedroom, but outside the bedroom. And, you often hear that, um, the way we live our lives outside the bedroom is reflected in the bedroom.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned a few of those ways, chronic stress. What other ways do you find that women live their lives outside of the bedroom that they kind of bring into the
Yeah.
bedroom?
Oh, lost in judgment, right? So judging oneself, having quite negative beliefs.
Mhm.
So I'm not good enough. I wish I could be doing more. I feel so broken. Certainly, maybe comparing oneself to what you see on social media. Why can't I be like that? Why can't I have a great relationship like as
Mm.
is portrayed in social media or among other friends? So there's definitely that heavy negative self-judgment component. And then there's also inattention. And the inattention piece comes from, I think, the almost universal nature of things around us that pull our minds out of the present moment. So the fact that we can be anywhere at one moment of time but the present moment. So we get pulled by beeps on the phone. Whether it's a tablet or a watch or a phone or something else that pulls us out of the present moment. There's also what I've observed to be this kind of subtle prizing of multitasking, right? So I often hear people say, "Oh, I'm a great multitasker," or "I wish I could multitask more," as if it's an ideal that we want to strive for. And yet we know, and there's been a whole body of cognitive science research that has shown us that it's a misnomer. Our brains are not actually capable of multitasking, or in other words, doing multiple things at the same time. Rather, what we do is our brains switch focus from one task to another to another. And every time we make that switch, there's a toll that it takes on our brain that results in less immersion in what we're doing, less enjoyment in what we're doing, more proneness to make errors, missing important details, etc. So we would do well to kind of give up this false ideal of multitasking perfection and rather adopt a belief of, I want to do one thing at a time and complete it and then move on to the next task. But all of those different things, the negative self judgments, the chronic multitasking, we bring into the sexual scenario.
Mm. Yeah, and I think also what I hear from a lot of midlife women, we're juggling fluctuating hormones, which bring up that sense of stress and inability to to manage various tasks, even though we try. But we have the various tasks. We have kids leaving off to college. We have elderly parents. We have relationship changes. There's so much happening in this midlife stage. And I think also as if you have children, if you are a young parent, I certainly have seen from women in my community that they struggle to manage the juggling the school activities, the being the soccer mom, the or managing a career, and then just being completely spent and not available
Yeah,
for pleasure when it comes to that time.
yeah,
And it's just such a real struggle. Can you share with us 3 tips that we can just start to do this in our regular lives outside
yeah,
of the bedroom before we step into the bedroom, that can just bring us into that present moment awareness?
yeah. Terrific question. Yeah, so, one way is, you can ask yourself periodically throughout the day while you're engaged in a task, "How am I feeling right now?" And just take a pause, even 30 seconds, and just sort of tune in, "How am I feeling?" And maybe the feelings will be physical feelings in the body. I'm feeling discomfort, I'm feeling joint pain, I'm, noticing my feet on the ground. But the feelings can also be more psychological, emotional feelings. I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling neutral, I'm feeling excited. So, just as a way of kind of building what we call interoceptive awareness, which is that ability to sense what is happening in the present moment. So that's one thing we can do. The second thing we can do is a bit more of an informal mindfulness practice. So, again, while you're doing other activities, say while you're standing in line at the grocery store,
Mm.
feel the bare sensations of your feet on the ground. So what actual sensations do I feel? Do I feel pressure? Do I feel vibration? Do I feel wetness? Do I feel hardness? And take that period of time to really infuse some of and build some of those mindfulness skills in the present moment. And then the third thing I would always advocate is a more formal mindfulness practice. And whether it be through an app, there are many, many different apps that are available. that deliver even 10 minutes a day of mindfulness, or one can jump onto YouTube and type into the search heading 10-minute mindfulness or 20-minute mindfulness, and then be guided through an audio guide on how to do mindfulness in a more structured way. We know that when a person practices mindfulness, and of course, this is a skill to practice, that it results in changes in our brain, both how our brain works in the present moment, but also structurally. So we see growth and development of centers in the brain, dendrites and axons in the brain as a result of practicing mindfulness. But of course, those changes won't happen without putting in the time to doing the
Mhm.
practice. So
Mhm.
again, finding the more informal ways in the day, but also really supplementing it with some formal practice.
So it is really about taking that pause
Yes.
during the day, whatever you're doing, to tune in and listen, feel, connect. I think that's so helpful. Thank you so much. You conducted dozens of studies applying mindfulness to the issue of low desire. What are some of the key findings in your research on how mindfulness practices can benefit women experiencing sexual challenges? And can you walk us through
Mhm.
one of those mindfulness protocols? I know in the book you outline a
Mhm.
few of them.
Yeah. So, we've come a long way since the first study that I did when I was a resident in Seattle, uh, learning mindfulness and at the same time teaching it to these cancer survivors. And in the early days, we started out with um, 3 monthly sessions. And of course, over time, as we gathered a lot of data from our participants and listened to what they wanted, we've really moved to an 8 session format delivered weekly, and we've done it face to face, we've done it online. We have a web enabled platform called eSense that we deliver it in as well. And so, what it tends to look like is first teaching people and helping them to adopt a regular, structured mindfulness practice. So maybe they start the first, 3 to 4 weeks with a daily mindfulness practice. And it can be as short as 5 or 10 minutes, and it can be as long as, 40 minutes or so. But helping them build this and prioritize it into their day um, before we then move that into the progressively more sexual scenario. And part of the reason why it's important to establish a practice first is so that we understand what are the patterns of the mind. How do I go about gently and compassionately bringing the mind back to the here and now as I'm scanning the body? How do I use mindfulness of thoughts, which is being able to kind of watch thoughts from a distance and be able to say, "Oh, that's a planning thought. That's a judgmental thought. That's a memory thought," without getting wrapped up into the content of the thought. So we do all of that for a number of weeks, troubleshooting as we go along. So for those people who say, "Oh, I just don't have time," we start in small bite-sized pieces. Can this be, can you wake up 10 minutes earlier in the morning? Can this be done on your break at work? Can this be done at the end of your workday in your car before you drive home. And then once the person feels like they have a kind of a solid foundation, they've started to become more familiar with the patterns of the mind. We then start to bring these skills into more sexual scenarios. So starting with the person on their own while they're observing their body, say in a mirror, or while they're having a bath or a shower, is using those same skills of present moment, non judgmental awareness to observe the body visually, but also through sensations. Then we progressively move along. We might combine it with an arousal exercise. So, having the person, for example, use a vibrator to elicit some sexual arousal, and then pair it with a mindfulness exercise to see what happens when I boost arousal. Can I use these skills to tune into it? What does arousal actually feel like on a sensation level without getting caught up in the storyline of, oh my gosh, arousal's here, what's gonna happen? Will it end? Will I lose it? Etcetera. And then from there, we move on. to those people who are in a relationship and want to bring these skills into partnered sexual activity. We provide some guidance and actual practice on how to do that. So it's very progressive. What we have found now in, yeah, many dozens of studies that we have done is that 8 weeks of mindfulness practice through the program can produce lasting changes in sexual desire. So, improvements in sexual desire, reductions in sexual distress, and significant improvements in relationship satisfaction and overall quality of life. And when we follow people many months out, a year out, they're continuing to practice these skills and they're continuing to benefit them from them in a significant way. So, pretty compelling finding that, we can't necessarily say when you're using a pill or a supplement or a
Mhm.
pharmaceutical that those benefits tend to wean off when the person stops using that particular treatment. And it's not the case in mindfulness. And because people notice improvements in other domains of their life, their mood, their kind of, quality of life, their happiness, they're quite motivated to continue to practice these skills in the long term.
So it's 8 weeks. Is that what it takes?
That's what we've evaluated.
Mhm.
When we delivered this with 3 sessions or 4 sessions, our participants told us they wanted more.
Oh,
So
really?
we've landed on 8 weeks, and that's pretty much been the structured practice that we do. Of course, clinically, because 'cause I'm also a clinician, I might adapt that. There might be some
Mhm.
people who, do quite well after 6 weeks, and there may be other people who have, lots of other issues going on, say severe relationship distress or maybe a history of trauma, or other factors that, 8 weeks is not sufficient, and so we have to really extend that out.
That's so interesting. When I was in the throes of menopause, I did an 8-week mindfulness course. I think it was based on is it MBS,
MBSR, mindfulness-based
MBSR.
stress reduction, yeah.
And at the time, I wasn't doing it for desire. I was doing it just to help me manage my menopause symptoms. And I just remember, I mean, there are practices that I still use today, right? Just
Mhm.
simple breath awareness practice. I remember the body scan. I would wake up in the middle of the night. And, you have those wakeful nights where you just can't go back to sleep. And I remember just doing that body scan, being able to just release tension, notice sensation through different parts of my body. And then I would just drift off back to sleep. And there is a practice that I love that's part of that 8-week course that is the mindfulness of eating practice,
Yeah,
which involves a raisin.
yeah,
And so I thought it would be fun if you could guide us through that practice. I have
yeah,
some raisins right here.
great,
And then
excellent.
maybe we can just show, since this is on video, and if you're listening, um, hopefully you'll be able to get a sense of what this practice involves.
Wonderful, thanks for the opportunity. Okay, so let's take a moment to just drop into the present moment and set aside the other things that you were just doing, maybe acknowledge some of the thoughts that you have and just let them pass on by just like clouds in the sky, and taking a moment to just come into the here and now, settle into your seat, maybe notice sensations in the body as we intentionally transition now to this mindfulness of eating practice. So to start with, I'll invite you to put the object in your hand. So take one of the little objects and just put it in the palm of your hand, resting there. Fix your gaze upon the object and just take note of whatever colors, the shape, the size, the contours, and what happens when you move your hand around a little bit, how that might change the light that's bouncing off of its surface. And just use this time to really settle into the present moment using visual sensations as your anchor point in the here and now. And you might be having other thoughts like, oh, this is silly, or oh, I so want to eat that, or I dislike raisins. And just acknowledge that those are patterns of the mind and we can set them on the shelf for the here and now. Next, what I'll ask you to do is pick the object up with your two fingers and closing the eyes. Tune into what it feels like, the sensations between your fingertips. There a softness, a hardness? What temperature is it? What happens when you move the object and wiggle it between those two fingertips? Moving it around, just bringing full attention to what it feels like at a sensation level in the here and now. And next, what you can do, still with the eyes closed, is move the object up to one ear and see if there's any particular sound sensations associated with it as you wiggle the object between your fingertips. And just letting whatever sound sensations meet your ear just as it is. And yes, there may be a thought, this is silly, what are we doing? Again, just acknowledge that that is the mind doing what it does. It thinks, it evaluates, and we can set that aside for the here and now. Next, move the object to your lip and just rest it against your lip, still with the eyes closed, paying attention. What do those sensations feel like? Coolness, warmth, pressure, softness, vibration. You might also notice, are there sensations building in the body? Is there salivation happening in the mouth maybe, with the object resting against your lip? Just taking it all in. You don't need to change anything. All of those sensations are available to us to simply observe. Next, you can open the mouth and put the object into the mouth, maybe on the tongue, without taking a bite. Closing the mouth and just observing what is happening now, what sensations are on the tongue, what sensations are in the mouth, and maybe even noticing your sensations of breathing while the object is resting there. There might also be an impulse to chew, a wanting to bite, or maybe some negative thoughts or sensations. And all of that is available for us to observe. And so now, very slowly taking one bite into the object and observing the burst of flavor, maybe the smell. And how would you describe those sensations as you take a single bite? And now, with intention, take some additional slow bites of the object, noticing the movement of the jaw, the object now breaking into smaller segments. And as you continue to chew the object, and as the remnants slide to the back of your mouth, down the esophagus, noticing all of the flavors, textures, tastes, the aftertaste and the echo of the aftertaste as the object now moves into the other parts of your body, swallowing whatever is left of the object. And before you open the eyes, just taking a moment to feel the body as a whole. Feel whatever sensations are there and also whatever emotions are there, just as they are, without judgment, without needing to change them. And when you're ready, opening the eyes.
Mm. Wow.
And
So
so
beautiful.
I
Thank
might
you.
ask you, Gabriella, what are you noticing?
I didn't want it to end. I wanted just to stay there and just linger and just keep going and just noticing that each little thing just felt so
Yeah.
wonderful. Putting it next to my ear felt kind of funny and silly. And then bringing it to my lips, I just felt this immediate tingle and then bringing it into my mouth. And then, wow, the burst of flavor. And
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to linger on each and every instruction. This is the beauty of this practice, right? That we get
Yeah.
to linger, we get to slow down.
Yeah.
And so often we don't invite those same qualities
That's
into
right.
our intimate relationships.
Yeah, it's so true. And, this eating practice, by the way, I call it an object on purpose, not a raisin,
Okay.
because if I say, put the raisin in your mouth and notice the raisin, you might start to have memories of raisins,
I
you
forgot
know?
that it was raisin.
That's right. It could be any object. It could be, a banana, it could be a piece of apple, piece of bread. And so it's intentional to help, especially if someone is new to mindfulness practice, it helps separate them from the story of the raisin, thinking about raisin bread or raisin cereal or whether they hate raisins or love raisins. So we call it an object to promote the present moment non-judgmental observation of it. And it's always the first practice that we do in our groups or even in my individual work with folks with sexual concerns. And then when I ask them the questions at the end of, what did you observe? What came up for you? What was that like? On their own, they will say, "Oh my goodness, if I could pay that much attention to a single raisin, imagine if I brought a fraction of that attention into my sexual intimacy. Imagine the things that I would notice and observe that I otherwise don't sense." And so, again, that's a really powerful thing of doing the practice is it allows people to make those connections and observe the benefits for themselves rather than me saying to them, "Here's how it works and here's why you should do it." Let's dive into the practice. Let's make this a regular part of our daily lives. And then for ourselves, be able to see where the benefits lie.
And there's so many opportunities for that, right? For that
Yeah.
noticing, for that paying attention. That, as I mentioned, we often rush through or don't even take time to notice. What were some of the benefits that the women who engaged in this 8-week mindfulness protocol
Yeah.
experienced?
Yeah, so we have delivered this to women who primarily have low desire or
Mhm.
difficulties with arousal. So we know that those concerns are very prevalent. So this is the person who says, "I'm no longer interested in sex. I'm not motivated to have sex. I only have sex to please my partner. I feel no arousal." Again, really, really common experience that women have. And so that group who we've studied in many, many different studies with thousands of women now, have said that they feel motivated for sex again. Again, once the experience of touch and connection and intimacy is enhanced, of course, and their motivation for that is going to improve. We've also delivered this to women who have vulvovaginal pain, so a condition called vestibulodynia affects about 15% of women, and it's characterized by quite sharp and very, very distressing pain around the vaginal opening. And we know that there aren't a lot of medication options. The oral medications don't work better than placebo. And even some of the topical or vulvar applied medications and creams are not without side effects. And because mindfulness has been tested for patients with general chronic pains, our rationale was, well, if it works for general chronic pain, like low back pain and chronic migraines, could it work for this chronic vulvar pain? And so we first did a number of smaller pilot studies and then did a much larger clinical trial, a randomized clinical trial, and indeed found that it significantly reduced pain intensity at the vulva as well as decrease sexual distress. So that was quite a profound, if you will, finding
Yeah.
because these are women who tend to show up in a gynecology practice, and now we have many of our gynecologists saying, "Please train me on mindfulness so that I can." At least tell my patients about the benefits of mindfulness for this chronic vulvar pain.
Where the reasons for this, because they were able to redirect their mind away from the pain to pleasurable sensations, say like
Yeah.
the one experienced with the raisin.
Yeah. So that was definitely part of it. The other part of it, though, was when these women experience their vulvar pain, they kind of get lost in the story of suffering. Will I
Mm,
ever be normal? Will I ever be able to have sex again? Will my partner leave me? And what the research tells us is that that kind of suffering directly compounds their pain intensity or makes the pain worse. So if we can keep them just focused on the bare sensations, the vibration when they feel pain, the location, the intensity, etc., while letting go of the story of suffering, it helps them cope better. And in turn, the brain sends less pain processing signals down and they experience less pain intensity.
that's fascinating. And
Mhm.
and it can be practiced. Like we did it with a raisin, but you can practice it with any type of food object, right? Any
Yeah.
type of sensory object.
Definitely, yeah. So for the eating meditation, ideally something that won't melt right away.
Mhm,
So dark chocolate works really well
mhm.
for this purpose. Other dried fruits, dried apricots, even a piece of apple works really well. And it's a great way to be introduced to mindfulness practice. And then of course from there we move on to the body scan, which is awareness of sensations in the body. We move on to awareness of breath practices. You can even do some gentle hatha yoga where you're kind of stretching and feeling those sensations, and then we always build on there.
Wonderful. So fascinating that you brought this into this field of sexual desire. I know that when women start this journey, it's a way of self-empowerment, which I think is
Mhm.
really taking matters into their own hands. And um, but there, if you're in partnership, there comes a point where you want to involve your partner,
Yeah,
right? And what do you help women navigate those conversations with their partners, especially if their partners perhaps aren't mindfulness
yeah,
practitioners? And what can we do to bring our partners in, especially if there's some hesitancy? What can
yeah,
women say to their partners to get them
yeah.
involved in types of practices?
Yeah, such an important question, Gabriella, because, on the one hand, we don't want women believing that, the root cause of their low desires lives within them entirely.
Mm, mm,
And that's often what women will say is, I feel broken. What's wrong with me? And very often there may be relationship related factors contributing to her low desire. So if you're with a partner that doesn't make you feel seen or heard or valued or loved, that's going to directly impact your motivation for sex with that same person. So addressing the partner, the couple dynamic is also really, really important. What I often empower women to do is to introduce it as a fun activity that they can do together, and they might even share some of the research that's been found that this practice can help couples in general feel more connected. It can help them communicate a bit better, etc. And so you can introduce it as just a fun thing we can try. And then maybe you play a recording of a 5-minute couples based mindfulness practice. So something, for example, like sitting on the floor back to back, and you spend 5 minutes just with your eyes closed, observing and feeling the sensations of those points of contact. And then after the 5 minutes, you stop and you flip around and you chat about what did you observe? How was that? So that could be a good way to sort of introduce it. And then from there, we've got a whole variety of other more couples based mindfulness practices. A classic one is sensate focus. And sensate focus has been around for many, many years. It was developed by Masters and Johnson in the 1950s. It wasn't originally described as a mindfulness exercise, but we know it absolutely is a mindfulness practice because what you're doing is as a partner is touching your body, you're invited to pay attention and observe the sensations just as they are. And then you switch roles and you kind of do 15 minutes one person, 15 minutes the other person. So the sensate focus practice, I often would encourage people to do it, under the guidance of a skilled sex therapist or psychologist to be able to process kind of what was it like and what emotions came up, etcetera. So, definitely these are skills that one can practice on their own, And ideally, if they're in a partnership, it could be something that they bring into that relationship.
And you have some of those practices in the workbook. I know there's
Yeah,
a couples-based practice. Um, you even have some recordings
yeah.
on your website, which I
Yes,
think
I
are
do.
so helpful.
Mhm.
I think audio is always a good tool to bring into the bedroom.
Yeah,
Uh, and yeah, listening it to an audio guided visualization or practice is just a fun tool.
yeah.
So
Agree.
any other practices that women can do to introduce more presence in the bedroom before they engage in intimacy?
Yeah, we've got an exercise we call sexual sensations awareness, and I sort of alluded to it earlier. And it involves first having the woman engage with a sexual tool. So maybe using a vibrator for a few minutes, or engaging in a sexual fantasy in her mind, or watching or reading some erotica. Now, those tools are not mindfulness tools. They really are about intentionally eliciting sexual arousal, but we also know that they work. That when women watch female-friendly erotica, that it does elicit sexual arousal in the body. And so we have an exercise we call sexual sensations awareness that involves first priming the body with those arousal sensations and then stop. So turn the film off or close the book or turn off the fantasy and then engaging in a brief body scan where you're deliberately moving attention to the parts of the body that have more intensity. So more intense, maybe arousal sensations. So the nipples, the vulva, the earlobes, the heart, etc. And I love this practice because so often for women with low desire, they will say, I don't get aroused. I don't feel anything in my
Mhm.
body at all. And sometimes, oftentimes, it's not the case. It's just that they're not noticing arousal in their body. So that could
Mhm.
be a really powerful exercise.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you mentioned that. I had a guest a few weeks ago, Sherry Winston, who's a holistic sexuality educator. She wrote the book Women's Anatomy of Arousal, and she gave that tip. I asked her, "What are your views about um, vibrators?" And she recommended sort of bringing them in, then putting it aside and noticing.
Yeah.
Especially, she's really very much about noticing, taking your time and noticing how your sexual anatomy, your vulva gets engorged and
Yeah.
noticing when you're ready to
Yeah.
move further. So taking your time. I love that. I've never thought about that. Just, just putting it down, not
Yeah.
using it as, the quick fix that you
Correct.
think it's meant to be, but really putting it down and noticing, taking time to notice. That's
Yeah.
that's that's a really fun way of incorporating vibrators. I asked on my Instagram community if they had any questions to ask you, and I have a few. If that's okay, if I ask you, I always have great sex on vacation, but it just seems to um,
Mhm.
go away when I get back to normal life.
Mhm.
What can women do to keep that spark alive when they
Yeah.
get back to normal life? And why
Yeah.
is sex vacation so
Yeah,
vacation?
because it's planned. There's nothing special about the wallpaper in the hotel room. It's
Uh,
it's because it's planned. People look at their day and they are intentional planning sexual activity, which means that then when the planned sexual activity arrives, they show up for it. Their mind shows up for it along with their body, and they're much more present than, say, at home with all the distractions. Oftentimes, sex is not planned or it happens after the evening news. The gas tank is empty, whereas on vacation, you might be more likely to have sex in the morning or the daytime. So there's nothing magical about the hotel room or the vacation. It's about what are we doing differently while we're on vacation that we can actually incorporate into our regular lives.
and what is one thing they can do when they come back into their regular lives to sort of keep that spark alive?
Yeah, so maybe on the commute home, they can say, when are we next going to have some time together, some
Mhm,
intimacy time and plan it?
mhm, mhm. Great one. That's a great one. Thank you. Another one, of women in my community, says, I practice mindfulness, breath awareness, sensory awareness, even during intimacy, but it seems to fall away the moment of penetration. I start to check out.
Mhm.
What can
Yeah.
I do if this happens? Is
Yeah,
this
so
common?
it is. It certainly is, and so mindfulness is not a light switch. It's not something that you have it or you don't have it. It's a skill that we can ease into and out of and come back into it. So, if the person knows that the moment of penetration is a time where the mind goes somewhere else, follow it, see where it goes, and then bring it back. And you might bring it back by anchoring yourself in your breath. What's my breathing rate like now? What do I feel at my fingertips? What are the sensations in my body? And sometimes we have to repeatedly do that over and over and over to come back to the here and now.
Hmm. And I also find it helpful just to name it sometimes, just to
Mhm.
name and
Yeah.
it's, my mind just wandered. Could
Yeah.
we just reconnect with
Yeah.
with perhaps some eye gazing? There's nothing wrong with just starting over again, right? It's
Exactly.
okay.
Great tip. Great tip.
um, Another one, I feel turned on and interested in sex, but as soon as I get into it, my mind wanders to thoughts about my business, my kids, my parents. It's
Mhm.
really hard for me to turn off that
Yeah.
daily to-do list.
Yep.
What those
Yeah.
daily stressors. What so they want they're experiencing feelings of
Mhm.
desire, but the moment they get into it, their mind again just switches to the to-do list.
Yeah. So it's gonna be a combination of the first 2 answers I gave. One
Yeah.
is planning it for a time of the day when you're more energized, when it's not bumping up against another big event that you have to do, so that's one thing. And then the second thing is, again, acknowledging that our minds multitask because we train them to multitask. And so that means when we step into sex, we have to be very intentional about redirecting the focus back into the here and now while not being judgmental or hard on ourselves for when and how often our minds take off.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. I love that non-judgmental and just having compassion for ourselves in that moment. Thank you so much.
Great.
Dr. Brotto, you have been really a wealth of information. I so appreciate the research, the expertise of that you bring to the space of women's sexual health and pleasure. Thank you so much for moving this conversation forward for all of us. Uh, could you please tell us how we can find you?
You bet. So you can find me on social media on Instagram at Dr. Lori Brotto, and you can follow our research at UBCSHR. So that's UBC Sexual Health Research.
Wonderful. And the recordings of your practices are also on.
Yeah. Those are on my website, which is loribrotto.com. There you can download them, you can save them on your devices and practice away.
And the accompaniment to your book is the workbook, which is
Yes.
just all practices, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Wonderful practices to incorporate into your day for day-to-day life as well
Yeah.
as intimacy.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brotto. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Gabrielle. It was a great conversation to have.
Such a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for joining in.